I'm Carson Horn, and it's time for another edition of Talkin' Tumors, where I break down the latest happenings in Auburn athletics. Let's get rolling. Grades and schedules. And I'm not talking about classes or school. No, I'm talking about Auburn athletics. What do you mean? I will explain that on today's episode. We have a really fun episode, I think, planned on this edition of Talkin' Tumors. We had a great episode last week. If you missed that episode, you still want to go back and listen or watch it. It's still on the Weagle YouTube channel. It is still available at the Talkin' Tumors wherever you listen to podcasts. You can listen to that episode that I did with Britt. A lot of fun. Really appreciated having Britt on last week and hope to do that again soon. But we are back to our regularly scheduled programming on today's show, and I have lots to get into regarding Auburn football schedule this year, breaking it down, looking at possible kickoff times that were announced last week. I want to get into that. I also want to dive into revenue sharing. I wasn't able to do that on last week's show because we had Britt on, so I pushed that to this week, so I'm going to get into that on today's show. Also talk a little bit about Auburn football and previewing the Georgia games. We continue our off-season or summertime opponent preview. We're moving on to the Georgia game this week, so we'll discuss that. We'll talk a little bit about Auburn recruiting. I don't typically do that this time of the year. However, I think it's become a pertinent enough topic that I need to address it on today's show, so we'll do that. We have a lot scheduled, and then we will finish out today's show by grading the athletic year for Auburn as it has finally come to a close. The athletic year goes from August through July, and Auburn has now completed the athletic year, so we will grade that as well. So enough said. I'm on my lunch break. I have to make this quick. We got to roll through this show because I got to get back to work. So not going to waste any more time. Let's get into it now. Starting with Auburn football schedule for this season. The schedule's been out for a while, but I haven't addressed it because I wanted to see the kickoff times before I really did a segment on this on the show. The kickoff times are here now, so now I want to break down Auburn's schedule. By Auburn standards, this is not an awful schedule. Yes, it's not easy. That is true. I don't think there is an easy schedule in the SEC, but Auburn, in its history, has played more difficult schedules than it will play this season. I do believe that is true. When I look at this schedule, I look at it in two parts. I think the first 6 games of the season are extremely challenging for Auburn. I think the back half of the schedule is a little bit easier. There's still challenging games in the back half. There's still some easy games in the front half of the schedule. But the way I look at the schedule is, can you survive these first 6 games? Because things could get really toxic really quickly for Hugh Freeze and this Auburn football program if these first couple of games of the season do not go well, and that is very much a possibility. Auburn opens the season at Baylor. We know that. It's going to be a Friday night game, August the 29th. But after that, listen to the schedule. Auburn returns home after that, plays Ball State, should be a win there. Then Auburn plays South Alabama, not a guarantee. South Alabama is a good team out of the Sun Belt, but that should be a win as well. But then after that, you have to go to Oklahoma, to Texas A&M, and then at home against Georgia. Auburn might not be favored in any of those 3 games. Now, Auburn does have a bye week before the Georgia game. That is important to note. But, man, those back-to-back road games, and we've discussed this a little bit on the show already, when Auburn has to travel to Oklahoma and then to College Station in back-to-back weeks, that's brutal. That's brutal. So the way I look at these first 6 games, can Auburn go 3-3? Can Auburn go 4-2? If Auburn goes 4-2 in this stretch of these first 6 games, I think Auburn's going to be sitting in a really good position to likely go and win 8 games this season. If Auburn goes 3-3, you're probably is going to be a little bit of a push, I think, to go. You'd have to go 5-1 in the final stretch of the final 6 games, which is possible. That could be tough. However, the back half of the season, as far as conference games go, the conference games in the back half of the season are more manageable when you look at strength of schedule. Auburn hosts Missouri, who is a good team, and Auburn, you could argue, could have and should have won that game last year against Missouri. They will host Missouri this season. You go to Arkansas, who should be one of the worst teams in the SEC this season. We'll talk more about them later on in the show, not on today's show, but in future episodes when we do the opponent preview of the Razorbacks. Auburn will also host Kentucky, who should not be a super strong foe either Auburn had one of its better wins and better games of the season last year at Kentucky. Then Auburn travels to Vanderbilt, which we know is not a guaranteed win. Should it even be an expected win? You freeze Diego Pavia, that storyline yet again. Auburn will have to travel to Nashville, but still, compared to Georgia, Vanderbilt's an easier opponent, but certainly won't be an easy game. But the brands you're talking about here, you're talking about Missouri, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Vanderbilt versus Oklahoma, Texas A&M, and Georgia. Which brands would you rather be facing? You'd rather be facing the teams you're going to play in the back half of the season versus the first half, but that doesn't mean that these teams in the back half of the season cannot and will not beat you. And then finally, Auburn closes the season against Mercer, and then the Iron Bowl, as we all know, to close out the year. So I think if Auburn can make it through the first 6 games of the season and have a solid record, especially if Auburn can go 4-2 in those first 6 games of the season, I think Auburn's going to position themselves well for the back half of the season, assuming your expectations this year are around 8 wins. You may have higher expectations. If you do, then Auburn probably needs to go, might even need to go 5-1 in those first 6 games of the season if you're pushing for Auburn to win 9 or 10 games. That's not really what I'm expecting, although I haven't given you my prediction yet. I'll wait till August for that. But those are kind of my immediate takeaways when looking at this schedule here in the summertime. First 6 going to be really, really challenging. Back half certainly could be as well, but it does get a little bit easier for Auburn in the back half of the schedule. As far as the takeaways from kickoff times, I really had 2 takeaways I had from it. One, Auburn only has 2 early kickoffs. One is the South Alabama game. That's 11:45. That one had already been scheduled. That's homecoming that day. And the other one is at Arkansas, which is you're going to have an 11 a.m. kickoff. You prefer it to be on the road. I do believe in that. Sometimes things that are said aren't true. Cliches aren't true, but I do believe a 11 a.m. kick on the road benefits the road team. So Auburn going to Arkansas and playing that game in the 11 o'clock Central Time hour, I do believe that will benefit Auburn. So it's nice that Auburn doesn't have any other early kickoffs at home besides the South Alabama game. As far as SEC games go, Auburn only has one for sure night game, but it's a big one. The Georgia game, Deep South's oldest rivalry, is going to be a night game this year. That is awesome. I cannot wait to see that. Auburn fans deserve it. Night games in Jordan-Hare Stadium, there's nothing like them. Super excited this rivalry game is going to be put in prime time. And if you're Auburn, you just hope Auburn competes and plays well in this game and has a chance to win it and doesn't embarrass themselves on a national stage against one of their biggest rivals. So I'm really excited about that game being a night game. Iron Bowl could be as well. A lot of Auburn's games are in that flex window, which means it's either going to be in the afternoon or night. But only 2 guaranteed early games. Besides that, it's either afternoon or nighttime for Auburn. So I think that's really, really good for Auburn fans and really good for this Auburn team. Should be in a good TV window. A lot of eyes will be on this Auburn team this year, and they'll have the chance to show what they're capable of and what they're made of this season. Alrighty. Moving on now to revenue sharing. We have talked ad nauseum about this on the show. I'm passionate about this. I enjoy getting into the nitty-gritty of the details of it and trying to understand how everything is going to work, what the future might look like for college football. I understand that not everyone cares about that, and I'm not going to bore you with the details that might affect Fresno State. I'm going to focus on the details that will affect Auburn because I do believe you care about that. So let me give you some background, some context before I dive into it. So last time we talked about this, the House settlement, which was in court, had not yet been approved by the judge. That has now been approved by the judge. Let me explain to you once again, in case you forgot, what the House settlement was. This was a conglomerate of lawsuits, all put into one, that the NCAA and as the defendant and the plaintiffs that were multiple other cases, the NCAA settled. And what is going to occur now is the NCAA is going to make back payments to athletes that were not able to receive NIL because it, at that time, was not legal. So NCAA is going to pay over $2 billion in back payments to athletes who did not receive NIL money while they were in college. And along with this settlement, now universities are allowed to share their revenue with current athletes. That is completely new. Never before has this been allowed. Now that is going to be allowed because of the settlement, and that's what we are focused on. The back payments didn't matter as much to us. That doesn't affect the fans or as much as what the universities are going to be doing now and moving forward, and that is sharing some of the revenue with the players. So how much is going to be shared? Well, the number is $20.5 million that universities can share. They can share up to that amount. However, it is important to note that $2 million of that is going to go towards the back payment. So really, you're down to $18.5 million that universities have to share and that they can share with their athletes of their universities. How the universities decide to share that revenue is completely up to the athletic department. You don't have to share a certain amount with the football team versus the basketball team. You can share it however you decide. Or if you don't want to share any at all, you can also do that. Everyone's going to share the max amount they can in major college athletics because they want to compete and they want to give their teams the best chance to win championships. So Auburn is going to share the full amount of money. John Cohen sent out an email explaining all this, a long email a couple weeks ago when the settlement was finally approved, explaining how Auburn was going to do it. He did not give a certain amount of percentages or numbers of how the money would be divided up, however. Some universities have publicly released that. Auburn has not. I do not know if they will or if they won't. I doubt they will. Now, Auburn being a public university, I do wonder if Auburn might be required or if a Freedom of Information Act is requested by someone, if they will have to release that information. That's above my pay grade. I do not know. But as of now, it doesn't seem like Auburn is planning to release how they plan to distribute this money. But the assumption is for major universities like Auburn, this is how Auburn is likely to divide up the money. Again, we don't know this for sure, but this is the assumption from many folks that cover college football, cover college athletics on a national level. They assume most universities that are competing in the SEC, the Big Ten, Big 12, ACC, so forth and so on, this is how they expect most of those teams to divide up their money. Around 75 to 80% of the revenue share money from the universities is likely to go to the football team. I would fully expect that to be the case for Auburn. As we know, Auburn is still a football school. As much as we love Auburn basketball or Auburn baseball, whatever it might be, Auburn is still a football school. Bruce Pearl is always quick to remind people of that, and he is Auburn's basketball coach. So the majority of the money, the vast majority of the money is going to go to football. Around 10 to 15% is likely to go to Auburn men's basketball. You could argue Auburn's men's basketball deserves more than that, especially after the success that this basketball team has had, this basketball program has had over really the last decade. But again, Auburn football is the heartbeat of Auburn University. Auburn football still brings in the most revenue, so it does make sense that the majority of the revenue sharing would go towards Auburn football. And then after that, you're probably going with 5-ish% towards Auburn baseball, 5-ish% towards Auburn women's basketball, and that might be it. There might be a little bit money left over for the Olympic sports, if you will, your gymnastics, your track and field, your tennis, your golf, so forth and so on at Auburn. But more than likely, those programs will get little to no money from the revenue sharing. The vast majority of it is going to go to football, a little bit to basketball, a little bit to baseball, a little bit to women's basketball. That is more than likely going to be the case, and that's the expectation around college athletics, not just pertaining to Auburn. So, of course, that causes some controversy. Those who are supportive of smaller sports, and even those who just want to see all sports succeed at Auburn, might have a little bit of an issue with that. I certainly understand that. I, for one, want all of Auburn sports to succeed, as I'm sure all of you do. However, there's only so much money to go around, and the majority of the money is going to go where the most money is made, and that is Auburn football. I am afraid that non-revenue sports are going to take a hit. This isn't something new. People have been discussing this for a long time, ever since we assumed that the House settlement was eventually going to get approved. People started to discuss what's going to happen to Olympic sports. I know the universities, I know John Cohen, I know President Roberts are doing their best to try to make sure that Auburn doesn't have to cut out these Olympic sports programs. That's a big deal. Some programs have already cut. Some universities have already cut some programs. I know Auburn is doing everything in its power to avoid that. And I certainly hope that does not become the case for Auburn. But even if these sports do remain, I expect that they will, they are going to get the short end of the stick. They are going to be at a disadvantage, especially at some universities that maybe don't have football or either don't hold football in as high of regard as we do here at Auburn or in other universities. Those universities are going to have an advantage, so they don't have to give as much money to football. They can use some of that money on some of their Olympic sports. It could put sports like softball, like track and field, like tennis, like golf, for instance, at a disadvantage to other universities. The good news is majority of universities that Auburn is going to be competing against in these other sports are also in the SEC, or also in the Big Ten, and more than likely they're going to be having the same type of split distribution that Auburn is going to have. The next question now that I hopefully I explained that as well as I could. Hopefully that made sense to you. And the next question, though, that you probably are thinking, that you have in your mind, say, okay, Carson, so we have revenue sharing now. People have been clamoring for this, saying this will help bring order back to college athletics. I've said as much myself. However, does this mean that there will no longer be any booster payments to players? Unfortunately, I don't think so. As a part of this settlement, college athletics created a college sports commission. And trying not to go into too many details here, the College Sports Commission has created a clearinghouse. It's called a Deloitte clearinghouse. It's what it is. It's called NIL Go is the name. And this clearinghouse is supposed to approve NIL deals. You're supposed to submit your NIL deal, and this clearinghouse will decide whether it's legitimate or whether it's just pay for play from a booster. This is supposed to bring order back. This group is supposed to have power to levy punishments on coaches and universities if they find out a player has a NIL deal that's not legitimate. However, I and many others have doubts that this is actually going to work, that this will actually be able to be enforced. I'm sure that they will be able to figure out what NIL deals are real and what aren't. However, I still doubt their ability to enforce these sanctions or enforce these rules, despite how admirable maybe the goal is. Right now I don't see that them being able to enforce it. And I'll explain why here in just a second. This settlement, the House settlement, was a massive, massive step for college athletics. Massive step forward. This needed to happen. We've been in a awful period, I would say, in college athletics, as far as just being where you had no rules. It was, you heard the term Wild Wild West. I'm sure you're tired of hearing it, but that's what it was over these last several years. You can't run a marathon without taking the first step. This was the first step. The House settlement was a big first step, but it's not the end-all be-all. There are still more steps that need to be taken, but the reason I and many others were clamoring for this to get approved by the judge is because if this didn't, we would still be having not even taken our first step yet. So that's why this was massive, but there's still much more to be done. I still believe, and many still believe, there either has to be collective bargaining or there has to be congressional legislation. Until that occurs, as admirable as this Deloitte Clearinghouse NIL Go system is that they're trying to run to enforce NIL rules and enforce legal payments to players and not just pay for play from boosters, I love it. I wish that it would work, but I don't believe it's going to. Even if coaches, and Greg Sankey has said that, the coaches agree to follow by the rules, they're not going to. As soon as one of their players has a somewhat illegal NIL deal and the clearinghouse says, hey, this isn't right, they can't have this deal, this isn't legitimate, and that player sues, you're going to have problems, and we're going to be back to where we were in the fact that you can't enforce anything. So until there is congressional legislation or there is collective bargaining, I just have my doubts that anything is going to be able to be enforced. So it's good that the university can now share money with the players. That brings the money in-house a little bit more, but we still need another step here. Step 1 is done, and it was a big one, but step 2 is needed still for us to have order and to be able to enforce rules, because right now I just don't think we're in that position. So I don't want to be a Debbie Downer. This was a big deal. Don't get me wrong. However, more steps need to be taken here. But how does this affect Auburn? So I explained all that, I hope. How does this affect Auburn in particular? I think it's to be determined. As I've said time and time again, Auburn is well-resourced. Auburn is going to be okay. Auburn's going to be able to compete with the best in the country. Auburn is not going to be at the tip top. They don't have Texas oil money, not as big of a university as Ohio State or Michigan, but Auburn does have great alumni, has great support, and does have supportive boosters. One could argue, and I think I've seen some people argue, that Auburn might have been in a better position pre the House settlement, before revenue sharing. Why is that? Because possibly revenue sharing helped even the playing field a little bit, that for universities that didn't have the pool necessarily and didn't have the same booster backing that Auburn has, it now gets them on a little bit even playing field, that they have the same $20.5 million to share as well. So you can make that argument, but either way, Auburn's going to be fine. Auburn is going to be able to succeed in this new era of collegiate athletics. Auburn brings in enough in its athletic department to be able to share revenue without too big of issues. Yes, they're going to have to take some cost-cutting measures. Everyone is. Even the biggest universities, even Ohio State, even Texas A&M and Texas, are making cost-cutting measures. Auburn will have to do the same. They haven't publicized those at this point. I don't know that they will. But Auburn is going to be just fine in this new era, but it's going to be an adjustment period, just like it was an adjustment period when NIL first became a thing and pay-for-play really became a thing again. It takes time, and we'll see how Auburn settles in and figures this out. They've taken a little bit more of a cautious approach, I would say, compared to some other universities, at least from the outside looking in. But I don't think that's a bad thing. Auburn trying to play it smart and not find themselves in trouble almost from the get-go. Auburn did the same thing when NIL started years ago. Auburn was a little bit slower getting into things than some other universities, but when it really got going, Auburn was at the forefront as far as being able to spend money and compete for championships. Although Auburn has yet to do that in football, the money to compete for championships has been there. And that kind of segues into my next point, because I made a point there a little bit about how Auburn was treating this settlement, how Auburn was handling the financial aspect of it. Recruiting has seemed to be a little bit of a lull for Auburn right now. I know some of you probably don't pay attention that closely to Auburn football recruiting until signing day. I totally get that, totally understand that. But there's been enough attention on this now that I felt that it was noteworthy enough for me to address in a summertime show. I usually don't discuss recruiting until signing day, although I enjoy following it year-round. But I've seen enough people talking about it. It's gotten enough attention that I wanted to address it. And the reason is Auburn sits right now with just 7 commits. According to On3 Sports, Auburn has the 23rd ranked class in the country. Recruiting rankings are what they are at this moment. But by August of last year, Auburn had nearly the majority of its class committed. Now, Auburn had some guys flip out of its class last year, had some guys flip into its class, added a few more commitments, so forth and so on. But Auburn had the vast majority of its class committed by the time the season started last year. That doesn't seem to be the case this year. And only 7 commits. I think it's highly unlikely that Auburn is going to have the majority of its class committed come kickoff on August 29th. I do expect Auburn will add some more commitments by the end of the summer, and they might even come close to doubling this number. But to expect near 20 commits by summertime, I don't foresee that happening. So why is that? Why is Auburn seemingly being a slower recruiting team after having 2 straight top 10 classes, after having a top 10 portal class this past year? It goes back to the point I just made. I believe Auburn is taking a cautious approach. Some teams were going ahead and pushing for commitments, it seemed like, prior to the House settlement being approved by the judge. They were commit now, we'll worry about finances later. I don't think Auburn wanted to put the cart before the horse, if you will. And I respect that. I don't think Auburn wanted to push for a commitment or offer something they would have to go back on. Because then you really find yourself in trouble. If you do that, you offer a certain amount of money. You say you're going to give a player a certain amount of money, a recruit a certain amount of money, and then you have to back off of it. It's not going to go over well for you. So I think it was a smart strategy by Auburn, if that is the case. Again, this is an educated guess from observation of how things seem to be shaking out for Auburn football recruiting. I don't have firsthand information of this, but this is my educated assumption. I've followed recruiting for a long time now. I know Auburn's not lacking in resources. I know that. So that is not the reason. Auburn is not all of a sudden poor. That is not the reason Auburn is struggling. So this is one reason I do believe that Auburn's recruiting has been a little slower, is because they've just been a little bit more cautious, because they're still trying to see how things are going to shake out as far as how NIL, revenue sharing, and everything's going to go. Now that that has been approved, I think Auburn should have a better idea of how the money's going to shake out and look like. Yes, everyone's still sitting on pins and needles about how this NIL go and the clearinghouse is going to go and whether or not it's going to be enforced, although I think many are in agreement with me, as I'm certainly not alone in believing that nothing's going to be able to be enforced as much as they might try. However, no one necessarily wants to be the first one in the pool, so I get that, and I think Auburn's kind of in that position. Let's wait and see how this plays out. The second reason is a prove-it year. I really do believe Auburn's lack of success these last 2 seasons is making some recruits a little bit uncomfortable maybe to commit. I do think that is playing a small role, maybe not a massive role, but I do think it is playing a role in the recruiting process. When it's year 1, when it's year 2, the results don't matter as much on the field because you're still selling them that you're rebuilding a program, but now you're headed into year 3, and year 2 didn't go well. So now proof of concept does matter more. It started to matter some last season. It's really going to matter in year 3, especially with the hot seat talk. It hasn't come from Auburn. John Cullen's been nothing but supportive. But outside Boise, these recruits are hearing it. There's hot seat talk around Hugh Freeze. And I'm sure other programs are negatively recruiting Auburn with the hot seat talk. So I do believe that has played a role into why Auburn's having a little bit harder time of getting commits. But if that is the case, you go and have success this upcoming season, then you're going to land a lot of these players and you're going to have another really good recruiting class. My concern level for Auburn recruiting right now is as close to 0 as it can get. I understand people that are concerned, but Hugh Freeze has turned in two top 10 classes. The guy knows how to recruit. Is Auburn facing some adversity in recruiting right now? Yes. You also lost 2 of your best recruiters on last year's staff. Has that played a role as well? Probably so. But Auburn has the resources to recruit at a top 10 level. They've shown that now the last 2 years. That's not going to change because of revenue sharing. And I also know Auburn has a really good recruiting staff with Hugh Freeze and the other assistants, despite losing Josh Aldridge and Charles Kelly from last year's roster, who were 2 of your better recruiters. So I'm not concerned about Auburn recruiting. If you take care of things on the field, the money's going to be there to land top guys, so forth and so on. It just might have to come at a little different strategy, come about it at a little different strategy this year than Auburn did last season. I would even go as far to compare it maybe even to Florida last season, which I know Auburn fans don't want the season to go like Florida's did, because Florida's season started out really poorly. It looked like Billy Napier was gone. And then all of a sudden, Florida turned it on the back half of the year, and their recruiting was in the tank, and then it comes all the way back, and I believe they finished with the top 10 class. That could certainly be a scenario for Auburn this season. I don't know if that will happen, but that's certainly a possibility, and that might be the strategy Auburn has to take this year as big dogs walk late, as the saying goes. That might be how Auburn has to approach recruiting this season. Okay, speaking of big dogs, that set up well for my transition into the Georgia preview. Today we're looking at Georgia. Auburn will face off with Georgia in the 6th game of the season in the Deep South's oldest rival. We already mentioned it earlier in the show that this Georgia game this year will be a night game inside Jordan-Hare Stadium. It's going to be really fun. Really excited for that game to be a night game. It's been an afternoon game for a lot of years now. It's been a while since it was a night game. And Auburn will look to get a win in this series again for the first time since 2017. Auburn has not beaten Georgia since 2017. 2 years ago, Auburn had a really good shot to win this game, but Brock Bowers really just took that game over, and Georgia ended up winning it. Last year, Auburn lost 31-13. The game was a little bit closer than the score would lead you to believe. Auburn was competitive in that game, but ultimately Georgia won it. Georgia went 11-3 last year, and they were SEC champs in what many considered, and I would agree, a down year for Georgia. From a talent perspective, From an offensive perspective, they just didn't seem very good, yet they found ways to win. And the reason they did that is because they're a championship program and because Kirby Smart is the best coach in college football now. And again, as much as you might hate saying that as if you're an Auburn fan, you have to admit, if you don't believe he's the best, you have to admit he's one of the best. But I would say he's the best coach in college football now. He is entering year 10 at Georgia. I cannot believe that. Year 10 in Athens. I feel like he was just in year 2 or year 3 just a month ago. But yeah, entering year 10 now at Georgia. They are last in the SEC in returning production. That's massive. That's massive for Georgia. It's massive for Auburn's chances to win this game against Georgia this upcoming season. There's a ton of unknown for this Georgia team entering this year. Now, the assumption is, and they deserve this assumption, is that Georgia's going to be fine. They get the Alabama treatment from the Nick Saban years, whether that's fair or not fair. The assumption is you're Georgia. You've shown you can compete for national championships year in and year out now. Despite you having the lowest returning production in the SEC, we're just going to assume that you're still going to be one of the best teams in the country and have the chance to win a national championship. Their talent roster, despite having a little production returning, is still very, very high, one of the best in the country. Still, they had the number 2 recruiting class last cycle. But again, lots of question marks. Gunnar Stockton is their quarterback. He took over for Carson Beck in the SEC championship game when he got injured. Took Georgia into the playoffs. They ended up losing to Notre Dame in the quarterfinals. What's he going to be? He looked okay in the games that he played for Georgia this season. He'll have an offseason to continue to develop his skills. He's a tough guy. Look, he's a gamer. I will say you have to be impressed by his mentality, even if you don't like Georgia quarterbacks. I understand that. But you could see the way the team rallied around him last season. He seems to be well respected by his team. He's a gamer. He's not the most skilled quarterback you've ever seen, but he is athletic. He is tough. So I'm interested to see how he pans out this year for Georgia. Wide receivers have been a major issue for Georgia. They brought in a couple transfer wide receivers that are talented. Their receiver room should be much improved this season, but that's still a question mark. And can they run the ball? Georgia could not run the ball last season very well. Can they fix that this year? They have some talented running backs, but they just struggled on the offensive line to really get a consistent push. Can they get that going offensively? And then defensively, I probably have less questions about. I really do believe that they'll be solid there as always under Kirby Smart. But I'm really unsure how this Georgia team is going to pan out. They have a really tough schedule, and I don't feel bad for them. They were in the SEC East for years and got to have what was essentially as much of a cakewalk in the SEC as you could was Georgia's SEC East schedule. But now they have a really difficult, really challenging schedule this season. And I think it's going to be a incredible opportunity for Auburn to knock off Georgia this season. If Auburn's going to do it within the next several years, this might be Auburn's best shot to do it. And we'll find out if they can in Week 6. I mentioned this game is coming off a bye for Auburn, which I think is really, really good, especially coming off 2 straight road games. Auburn's going to have a bye, try to heal up, and then come up with the best game plan that Hugh Freeze can and DJ Durkin can to come up with to have a chance to beat Georgia this upcoming season. Okay, let's get into grading the athletic year for Auburn. This was tough. I did this last year, and I wanted to do it again now that the track and field, the last sport that still needed to finish up, they did this past weekend, so now we can grade the athletic year for Auburn. We're going all the way back to August of 2024, and this athletic year went from August 2024 to now, June of 2025. So let's start out with football. Just like in any class that you take, especially, I just graduated from Auburn, as you all know. Any class you take is weighted, so not every assignment is equal. Usually your exams are worth the majority portion of your grade, and that's how I kind of grade Auburn athletics. Football is going to be worth the majority. I just mentioned to you that football is getting around 80% of the revenue sharing. I'm not going with 80% of the grade being determined by football, but it's a pretty high percentage. It's definitely more than half is going to be dictated by Auburn football, because again, that's where people view your university for the most part in the South. And in the SEC, your view by and how your athletic program is really determined by how good your football team was. Whether that's fair or not, it's not fair, but it is how you are judged. So football is going to get a high percentage. And that's the bad news for Auburn athletics, because Auburn football, in my eyes, I gave an F this season. I debated going with a D. I think I gave a D last year. Here's my thing. If you're not bowl eligible, it's an automatic F for me. If you want to go based on the scale of 3-9 of 2012 being the worst year in the modern era that's possible, then okay, then you would have to give this year a D. But anything below bowl eligible is an automatic F for me. So that's why I gave Auburn football an F. So that's going to pull down the grade a good bit for Auburn athletics overall. However, Auburn basketball and Auburn baseball gave this grade a big boost, because Auburn basketball gave an A+. Won the SEC championship, made it to the Final Four, had the best year in program history. That's an A+. You can't ask for anything better than that. So A+, that helps bring the grade up a good bit, because the men's basketball holds a high percentage here. And then Auburn baseball gave an A. Not quite an A+, because Auburn baseball did not make it to Omaha, but did host the Super Regional, did win its regional. So Auburn baseball gets an A. So you go with an F for football, but Auburn basketball and Auburn baseball really helped make up for as much as you can for a really disastrous Auburn football season. I know football is king. I've said it 100 times. But Auburn baseball and Auburn basketball gave Auburn fans a lot to cheer for. If those seasons had gone off the rails, it would have been a really, really brutal year for Auburn athletics. As for some of the other sports, I gave softball a C for this year. We talked a little bit about Auburn softball in last week's show. First year for new head coaches Chris and Kate Malvo. A solid year for the first year of what is a little bit of a rebuild for them. So I gave them a C. Golf, I gave an A. Couldn't give an A+, because Auburn golf won the national championship last year. Came really close to doing it again. So I gave Auburn golf an A. Women's basketball gets an F. It was a disastrous year. Coach Jay was fired at the end of the season. Nothing went right for women's basketball, so they get an F. Auburn volleyball had a really down year after having a really good year 2 years ago, so they got a D. Track and field got an A+. Individual national championship for Jacoby Tharp this past weekend. They also won the men's 4x100 natty in hurdles. It was a really, really good year for track and field, so they get an A+. Soccer made the second round of the NCAA tournament. Equestrian had a good year. Tennis and swim all had good years as well. So putting that all together, I went with a B-. I debated between C+ and B-. It was, again, how much stock are you putting into football? I didn't put an exact percentage on football. I told you that I would have it above, a little bit above 50%. But I'm going with a B- for this year for Auburn athletics. You could give me a C, and I would understand, but I'm going to go with B- because of the year that Auburn basketball and Auburn baseball had, as well as some of Auburn's Olympic sports that all had really good years too. So I'll go with B-. Maybe I'm a friendly grader. Maybe people would enjoy taking my class if I were grading it. But I'm going with B- for Auburn athletics, and here's to hoping for an A+ year from Auburn athletics in the 2025-2026 year. And maybe Auburn football, Auburn baseball, and basketball will all have big years. We'll see. We'll find out. But I did this segment for the first time last summer, and I wanted to come back and do it again this year. I think last year I had it at a B+, I believe, for the year. So a little bit lower this year, going with the B-. Okay, to close out today's show, I wanted to hit on a few other topics. One other topic, because I already addressed track and field. That is the news that Auburn basketball promoted Ian Borders to replace Chad Pruitt, the assistant from Auburn basketball, who went on to go into full-time ministry. Certainly applaud that and wish Chad Pruitt the best in his call to ministry. Super excited for him. But Ian Borders was an assistant already, off the court assistant for Auburn basketball. He's been promoted to an on-court assistant to replace Chad Pruitt. So I did want to comment on that and look forward to keeping up with the news on Auburn basketball as they are continuing to go through their summer workouts. We'll have more on Auburn basketball in the future of Auburn basketball in later episodes, but really appreciate you all tuning in to today's episode. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I mean, more than you know, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening to the podcast, thank you so much. If you haven't already, I please ask for you to like and subscribe to the show. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe. If you're listening on podcasts, and we'll be back with another edition of Talkin' Tumors next week. Thank you for listening to Talkin' Tumors. If you liked what you heard, make sure to subscribe and follow @Talkin' Tumors on social media so you'll never miss an episode. War Eagle.